Okay, so I'm making a puff pillow. My first time making a puff pillow, so I was quite excited to try it. So I started off with a 5-inch square template, and I made that out of hard cardboard. And then I used some scraps of fabric to make various squares. I made 25 squares. And it depends how comfortable you are in cutting multiple layers. So I use sometimes 4 or 5 layers of fabric on top of each other and cut that 5-inch square. And then I also used a 4.5-inch square. But this fabric, I used like an old sheet fabric that you're not going to see this fabric. It's going to be at the back of the pillow. So don't use nice fabric. Use fabric that you have spare that you don't want to use for anything, or an old sheet or whatever, because this fabric is going to be at the back and you won't see it. Okay, so now we're going to put the 2 pieces together, and we're going to put the bigger piece on top. So the bigger piece, which is your nice fabric, the 5-inch squares, are going to be on top, pretty side up, and we're going to match corner to corner. Doesn't matter on the bottom part of the fabric because you're not going to see it, so it doesn't matter pretty side or whatever, but the top fabric, your nice fabric, pretty side up, and match the corners carefully. And I'm using applique pins. I find the applique pins really nice to use because they're smaller and I don't tend to stick myself with them very much, so that's quite nice. So I'm just matching up all the corners here carefully, and you can see then already that we're going to have that little puff then from the excess fabric. So pretty side up from the 5-inch square, and then you match it up to a 4.5-inch square of your scrap fabric that you're not going to see, that's going to be on the back. So you match up all 4 corners first, and then I'm hand sewing these, but of course you can machine sew. But I quite like a bit of hand sewing, so I decided to hand sew these ones because I thought it would be fun. But you're more than welcome to machine sew, of course. So here are all the 4 corners matched up, and now we're ready to do our sewing. Okay, so now we're going to do the fold in the middle. So what you do is you fold it in half, and then you can see that little bit of excess fabric from your 5-inch square, and then you carefully, it's kind of a little bit fiddly when you begin, but once you get used to it, it's okay, and then you fold it over, and it's important to always fold it in the same direction. So here I'm folding my fold to the left, so I'm going to fold it to the left on each side, and that's important to make sure you always fold it to the right, to whichever direction you want, to the left or the right, but it's always going to be the same direction. And you can see I'll put another applique pin there to hold it in place, and I'll show you again on another side. So fold it in half, corner to corner, and then you have that excess fabric, excess, and then you just hold on to that little bit of excess, and again I'm folding it to the left, but you can fold it to the right if that's more comfortable, as long as it's always in the same direction on each of the sides. And then I'm going to add a pin, and you do that to each of the sides. What do you think of this? Okay, so now it's time for the sewing, and I'm starting at the pleat. I'm just using a normal needle that I use usually for my applique, and just normal thread. I like to double up my thread. So I'm just going to sew through. I'm carefully going to go through the crease, and then I'm just going to do a basic running stitch. Nothing too fancy, fairly close to the edge, because later on I'm going to machine sew the squares together, I decided, and so you don't want that to show on the front. So fairly close to the edge, so that later on you can do your 1/4 inch on the machine. I'm just doing just a normal running stitch, and then of course make sure you pull it straight, not too hard, and then just go all the way around with your basic running stitch. And just be careful of the pins, of course, but not too big a stitch, not too small a stitch. Doesn't have to be beautiful. It's just to get these two squares together. Make sure that you're always pulling it out straight, and then just keep going around with your basic running stitch, just being a bit more careful where the folded edge is, so that you don't lose that folded edge. And I was worried about doing these puff quilts about, always getting the fold exactly in the right spot. But it all turns out nicely. It doesn't matter if it's a little bit more to one side than to the other. It all comes out quite nicely. And you can see there I'm using a thimble there, because otherwise I tend to get a hole in my finger if I'm pushing the needle through. So just being really careful there. Depends if you use a thimble or other things to protect your fingers. And again, just pulling it out carefully. And then when you come up to the fold, just making sure to do an extra kind of secure stitch over the fold. And I think I always did a little over stitch there, just to make sure everything is secure. And just go all the way around, not leaving a gap. We're not turning these inside out. As you can remember, we're having the pretty side up. We're not turning anything inside out. So you sew all the way around, no gaps, because we're going to do the puffing from the back at the end. So sew all the way around so that it's all closed. Okay, so here's my first finished puff. And you can see that I've carefully sewn around with my running stitch, making sure to always straighten out the fabric and making sure there's an anchoring stitch over the fold. And you can see there's plenty of room for puffing later, and there's no gaps, so you sew all the way around. Now make 24 more, so you have 25 altogether. Okay, so now you've got lots of pretty puff squares sewn all the way around, pretty side up, making sure I have a nice anchoring stitch there to keep those side folds in there. Then arrange all your different colours in a pleasing manner that you like the best. I moved things around a fair bit to make sure the same wasn't closer next to the same. And I really love using scrap fabric for this because it makes it look so nice. And then I just sewed them together in rows, and then sewed the rows together to get my finished square here. Okay, so now you've got your rows all sewn together, or the puffs together, and at the back you'll see this. It's pretty neat actually, not too bad. And now you can make it into pillow any way that you like. You can make a zip back as well. I usually just do two pieces overlapping each other, and I fold over the top edges and sew them down. So basically I just get two pieces about 3/4 of the way along the pillow length. I get two pieces like that. Then I fold over the edge, iron that, then fold it over again so you have a nice clean edge, and then sew along there. So I usually don't do my pillowcases that you sew them and then turn them inside out. I like to have the pretty side facing down, and usually I do this with like quilted pillow tops because I like putting the border on like a quilting binding. So I put the pretty side of the pillow facing down, then I put the pillow backing. I think even if you had a zippy backing, it would be the same. And if you wanted a directional, then you'd make sure that the top bit is on your directional. Some people like that. I guess it doesn't really matter, but you know, the look of the thing. So if that was my direction, then I'd be putting that top bit on top, if that makes sense. So now I'm going to sew round, all the way around 1/4 inch. No need to leave any gaps because everything is the right side out. You've got the pretty sides facing out, the wrong sides facing in. Those are the true wrong sides. And I'm going to sew around the outside of the whole pillowcase. Okay, so I've put my binding on. Still everything to the front. Everything is nice side out. You can do your binding any way that you usually normally do for your quilts. I quite like this pocket type technique, and the description is below. The link is below in the description, and I quite like this way of doing it because it's not too fiddly and doesn't need any measurements or anything like that. And I've used just strips, leftover strips from a jelly roll. So that's 2.5 inches wide. And the whole thing so far is 20 inches by 20 inches. And so I've done that. One thing to remember is you can either do a scant 1/4 inch when you're putting your pillowcase together, or you do a larger 1/4 inch when you're doing this, because you don't want the stitching from when you've stitched the back of the pillowcase and the front together. You don't want it to show with your binding. I mean, if you're super clever and amazing, you can probably do all things together, have the back of the pillowcase, the front, and the binding, and do it all together. But ooh, that sounds a bit scary. So just to make sure, because you don't want that stitching to show, so either do scant or normal 1/4 inch here, or like a bigger 1/4 inch here if you've done just a normal 1/4 inch here, if that makes sense. All right, so now I'm just going to iron my binding out, just like usual, and with the corners. And then I like to hand sew my binding. So once you've ironed it to the other side, some people do stitch in the ditch, and then they catch it at the back. Or some people actually, sometimes I do my binding starting from the back, and then when I fold it over to the front, I do a stitching along. So it just depends on how you like to do your binding. But I'm just going to flip it over and do some hand sewing at the back to attach that binding. But up to you how you do the binding bit at this point. There's so many different ways, and people have they're usually their favorites on how to do the binding. All right, see you on the other side.